Yes, I know. I've made way too many videos on him already, but please do trust that I will be out of white boy jail after this one last take. Cause here's the thing. When I played that part during the 4.1 Archon Quest where Lyney confronted Wriothesley, I didn't initially think much of it cause you know me. I trusted him a lot and I could see from far away that there was just a misunderstanding and he wasn't actually harming the siblings. However, recent conversations on Twitter range from Lyney's stance painting Wriothesley as the literal spawn of the devil, and on the opposite end, there are people who brush off his threatening tactics way too easily. And as much as I am greatly inclined to defend Wriothesley because I understand his character very well and adore him, I do realize that there really is a lot of nuance to this issue that's worth discussing beyond reactive blaming and defending. Now you see why I had to make a video on this, because if I had to type my arguments on Twitter, the thread would consist of 200 tweets and people will deliberately misunderstand more than half of it, and I'll be pressured to clarify points I've already made. So now you see why I cannot be released from white boy jail yet. I need to earn my last few credit coupons before leaving. But before I proceed with my analysis of that confrontation scene, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to my channel if you think you'd find these kinds of commentary content interesting. And I also hope you'd watch the entirety of the video, as some points might be missed and potentially misunderstood if you don't. And I must say that as unbiased as I attempt to be, I do understand Wriothesley the most, so lots of this analysis will be told from his perspective. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Just so we're on the same page, I'll give a little recap of what happened. So the House of Hearth siblings were sent down to investigate both Tartalia's disappearance and the Forbidden Zone in the Fortress of Meripede, which supposedly contains Lady Farina's gnosis. Fermine followed the pipes and searched for a child using his diving prowess, and Lynette was assigned to continue gathering intel on the Forbidden Zone. This was when she was taken in by Wriothesley, which was why a note was left in her place in the infirmary. Naturally, like the protective older brother he is, Lyney confronted the Duke himself. In return, he was offered a highly restrictive choice: to summon Father Arlecchino down to the prison to have a chat with His Grace in return for getting to see his siblings again, or doing nothing and risking the safety of his siblings. He breaks down because he doesn't want to do either, and Wriothesley feigns following through with his stated plan, but in actuality he summoned Chlorant to summon Femine, and also presented Lynette to her twin eventually. All's well that ends well, or so it seems. The point of contention here is not about if the siblings turned out physically fine, but people are interested to know if Lyney's mental health was damaged by Wriothesley's blackmailing attempt, regardless of whether he followed through or not. And oh boy, of course it was. It definitely was a rehashing of Lyney's trauma, regardless of the fact that Wriothesley wasn't aware of his childhood experiences with nearly losing Lynette. So does this mean we should immediately cast doubt on the warden's morality? Well, if it were that simple, then this video would be a lot shorter, right? To make the process a bit more systematic, why don't we first ask what Wriothesley's reasons were for pressuring Lyney in such a harsh way? Well, obviously he did it in response to the Fatui's infiltration of his turf and breaking the rules of the Fortress of Meripede, but how do you go from being pissed about rule violations to pressuring and threatening this young individual? It seems a bit much, right? But perhaps I can attempt to take you through his thought process. Let's say you're the custodian of a location with lethal water under it, and you've been very careful about managing its leakage because you don't just take care of a place but its residents as well. Then now someone is prodding at those sensitive locations that contain the secret of the spicy water you're trying to guard, and to add on top of that, they're part of the same organization that has been breaking into your place for quite a while now, but this time the agents they sent were kinda young, so you leave them be for a while, especially because they're investigating something you're interested in knowing too. But then you know they'll end up getting very near that spicy lethal water, there, and you're worried about their safety too, even though they literally infiltrated your place, and now you have to pay your insanely strong swimmer friend a risk premium for retrieving one of these little guys, even though they were the ones that got into trouble in the first place. And like, you really care for these kids and won't allow them to get hurt, but at the same time, it's like, you know, they could have prevented this if they had just followed the damn rules. However, you're not easily angered at all because of your chill personality, and you're rather uninterested in being punitive, but you can't let them off either, because these kids did do something wrong and you have to let them know what they did wrong, despite also arranging the logistics around saving the youngest among them. So what do? Perhaps you'd consider simulating negative consequences for them so that they still feel a sense of guilt, even though you've mitigated the amount of suffering they would have felt had you not done anything at all, and your help might give them the wrong idea. To clarify, what I mean by simulating negative consequences is that he put on an act of villainy to send a message to the House of Hearth siblings, even though he wasn't intending on following through. Because at the end of the day, if all siblings were safe despite them committing these infractions of the rules, then it sort of gives them the impression that they did nothing wrong because there are no negative consequences. So Wriothesley made it look as if there was gonna be some form of punishment to incite the reaction he wanted out of Lyney, to know that these brazen Fatui siblings are in fact capable of regret for their actions. I will discuss later whether this is a right or faulty way to think of it, but consider this idea first. What if Wriothesley's harshness stems from him trying to counteract or compensate for his innate kindness and propriety? In an effort to not spoil Nouvelette's story quest, I'm not gonna tell you the context of this quote, but Wriothesley stated that those from up there have a tendency to sympathize with others, however down here such thoughts will put you at high risk. In Wriothesley's own story quest, which yes, I will spoil because it's important to the discussion, you will see this concept in action as he puts an extremely abusive prison organization leader named Dugier in a chokehold, but it's clear to the audience that obviously he wouldn't kill the guy. And while this guy was struggling, he invoked the rules of the prison, which was rather hypocritical considering what he did. So it seemed like he was appealing to Wriothesley's proper rule-abiding side in a brazen attempt to avoid being on the receiving end of the Duke's wrath. Then, at the end of the story quest, Wriothesley was asked about how he plans to punish Dugier, who basically injected Aqua Dolores, or liquid sorrow, into his subordinates' heads to manipulate them into submission. His answer? It was to do nothing and let him anxiously imagine the type of punishments that might be inflicted on him, stemming from his own sense of guilt and or his fear of the prison administrator. Those two can be combined because you will probably exhibit greater fear if you're guiltier. And while that does sound like a smart move, I did also get a sense that even the Lord of the Fortress of Meropide was quite lost and unsure when it came to dealing with such a matter. Because how does one effectively mete out punishment to someone who injects people's heads with liquid sorrow while staying within the bounds of human rights? Locking him up in a detention center as per usual protocol seems too light of a punishment for someone so vile, but it's not like he, nor anyone else, deserves torture either. So what is really there to do? Sometimes in these cases, it seems that your own sense of righteousness is getting in the way of true justice as much as it upholds it. So it can be a very confusing situation. If you listen to Wriothesley's voice line about Lyney and by extension the rest of the siblings, you'll find that he admits to caring for them enough to not let them get in harm's way. But he also phrases it as some sort of weakness of his, which the Fatui could have used to ensure that the mission would be completed smoothly by these young individuals without the Duke intervening out of a hesitation to harm them. So now he's pressured to signal that while he doesn't want anything bad to happen to them, he also wants to take their misdeeds seriously, hence why he turned to that concept of what I would call simulating negative consequences. Is that the most ideal course of action? No. But was it the best thing His Grace could think of? Probably. The way we as a society conceptualize punishment for crimes is in terms of jail sentence, basically just the number of months or years spent there. We hope that the deprivation of mobility would be a sufficient and fair consequence for people who break the law, and for severe infractions we simply lengthen the amount of time they spend deprived of their freedom of movement and the freedom to choose certain things like their food, accommodations, etc. Some countries have the death penalty, but that's rare and rather frowned upon, as it should be, because I'd argue that's against human rights, but that's a whole other thing entirely. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that our concept of fair punishment practically revolves around one type of punishment only, which is time spent in jail. So we don't tend to consider what other types of consequences would be fair or not fair, aside from fines or community service. So other disciplinary tactics can seem rather confusing or unacceptable to us. In the context of what we're talking about, the Fortress of Merpid is their jail already, so we can't default to the usual punishment of sending criminals to jail because they are already in jail. Well, Novelette's story quest and the world quest Unfinished Comedy do specify that an inmate can be sent to solitary detention, but it may not prove to be effective in more extreme cases, especially when you can tell that the criminal inmate is brazen enough to repeat their actions once they come out of detention. They're no longer threatened because it's not the worst case scenario for them, as much as jail represents the worst case scenario for people in the overworld. Hence, maybe the prison's administrator can try different forms of punishment. But here's where that gets tricky, because they would need to discern the morality or fairness of their plan of action according to their own principles instead of written protocol. It's kind of like playing God in a sense, and while that sounds like it makes you very powerful, it can be a lot of pressure as well, since these officials are only human. In a weird sense, it's kind of like parenting, where there aren't such set rules. So let's say if your parents want to discipline you without spanking you, they might try different tactics like scolding, guilt tripping, maybe even shaming, depending on how badly you misbehaved. And as bad as that sounds, it really just is an attempt to be effective in making you realize what you did wrong. Some of it may be successful, some of it may be damaging without them intending it. Like if your mom yelled at you for wasting a bunch of garlic by burning them, and it resulted in you being horribly afraid of cooking, I don't think that was the effect she was going for, yet it still did end up damaging you slightly. Of course, that's not to say that Wriothesley is equally as blameworthy as your parents, because he should have a stronger sense of responsibility and more experience to motivate his decisions. But what I'm saying is that the idea of meting out punishment creatively, using your own rules, can be extremely difficult to navigate. And no, I'm not using this argument to excuse Wriothesley's actions. Instead, what I'm trying to say is maybe we can try pondering the question of how do we identify if a specific form of punishment is truly fair and commensurate to one's misdemeanor? And also, how do we implement that form of punishment? Or how do we rank these types of punishment against each other? For instance, perhaps we can also get creative. If I were in the Duke's position, perhaps I'd try to do traditional guilt tripping, but only after the siblings have reunited already. I might say stuff like, Fermine could have died because of you, while he's physically present already. I might also make them reunite, then bring them to separate isolation rooms to deprive them of their company from one another, to teach these siblings a lesson since they love each other so much. Another option I can try is assigning extra supervised community service tasks to them within the fortress, so even if they don't necessarily feel guilty at that moment, they'll somehow be able to compensate for their misdeeds. So it's like an exchange agreement, sort of. But then again, because these are stuff I came up with, they stem from my own personal sentiments and sensibilities, and they might not accord with your own. Some of what I said might sound too light or too harsh, and perhaps they aren't grounded in the actual thought processes of criminals. Some of my suggestions might even brew more resentment than Wriothesley's fake blackmailing, because his act of kindness was revealed after the threats, making it easier for the siblings to recall the feeling of relief rather than if you make them reunite first, then punish them. They might feel bitter afterwards and they'll forget the good you did for them. Perhaps a solution would be to have a better evaluation or consultation system. Maybe it'll be a good idea for Wriothesley to survey some prison guards, some prisoners, some Palais Mermonia staff, some citizens, or even Neuvillette himself regarding what they think of his disciplinary tactics, so that it's more reliant on a collective sense of morality rather than having the inmates be subject to his ethical principles alone. However, it can also end up being detrimental to the wrongdoer's well-being if the opinion of the majority leans towards punitiveness that's harsher than Wriothesley's own wrath. The point I'm trying to make is that deciding on a proper punishment for a certain wrongdoing that goes beyond our socially acceptable concept of jail time is a very complicated and delicate process that's highly reliant on standards of ethics which are up to debate even until now. So the goal is not to arrive at a single answer, but to continue asking and discussing the question, what is the proper punishment for this? That way, we're not only trying to condemn or defend Duke Wriothesley, but also seeking to refine and articulate our own ethical standards as well. And of course, we have to remember that this sort of blackmailing scenario didn't just spring out of nowhere. It was a response to a violation of the prison's rules in such a way that was not simply rude, it was dangerous. The siblings were sent as infiltrators, so their purpose in and of itself was rule-breaking in nature. So there was a non-zero chance that they would get caught by the officials, and they knew this. Aside from that, there were unforeseen dangers to their mission, and they still took it on despite this. If the prison admin was too punitive, the siblings could have suffered a worse punishment, and if the Duke was too neglectful, then they might have failed to rescue Femine. All of this to say, their mission was inherently dangerous, and something bad was bound to happen eventually. It was probably only a matter of the degree of misfortune they'd encounter. As I said, Wriothesley worsened this misfortune for Lyney by seemingly blackmailing him, but he also alleviated this misfortune greatly by commissioning someone to save Femine and preventing Lynette from approaching the Forbidden Zone. Wriothesley probably could have responded better to this scenario, but it's still worth noting that there really was something important that he had to address, and I do really feel the need to explore how strange the circumstances of the infiltration arrangement were. I remember this joke on Twitter saying something like, Lyney went through the whole damn trial to clear his name in Act 1, only to end up going to jail willingly in Act 3, and that illustrates just how absurd the situation was. They probably thought that the worst thing that could happen was getting caught and didn't even consider that the actual worst thing that could happen was going on the mission in the first place. So as much as Wriothesley probably shouldn't have done that fake blackmailing thing with Lyney, the siblings shouldn't have gone to the fortress in the first place, although that's definitely not to say that I'm blaming them. But before I continue, have you ever thought deeply about the implications of the concept of loyalty? It's often used positively, referring to being faithful to your partner, serving the same company for 20 years, or living in your country despite the standards of living being tough because you want to help your fellow citizens. Yet have you thought of the ways in which loyalty can be detrimental? Like when you cover up a crime because it was done by your family member, or when you support your government's mistreatment of another nation because you quote-unquote love your country, or when you just fail to question authority in general because of how much you blindly trust them. Isn't that loyalty that's gone too far? That's actually why I'm less inclined to strive to be hardcore loyal, and instead I think the quality of being discerning is better. So you stick to something because you believe it is worthy of being supported based on a long process of reflection, and not because you simply feel compelled to, purely due to a sense of attachment. then your loyalty could be reasonable and bounded rather than extended infinitely. So, why am I rambling about this, you may ask? Well, that's because I think there's a lot to examine about the orphan's sense of loyalty to the House of the Hearth and their father, especially when it comes to Lyney, who seems to be the strongest advocate for them. I've heard some fans say that Wriothesley and Lyney are both similar for being orphans, but I think the similarities end there considering how vastly different their approaches to their struggles are. Wriothesley as a person seems to have a strong knack for questioning and rebelling against authority, something which has ruined his life in some sense when it led to him murdering his foster parents, while also being something that turned his life around for the better when he challenged the former prison admin who arbitrarily emptied his credit coupon account, leading him to eventually replace this official. He's one to respond strongly to acts of injustice, especially when directed towards himself, showing a strong sense of self-preservation to a rather good degree, I must say. Like he's totally not trampling down on others, he just makes sure he's not maltreated. Lyney does seem to be similar on the surface. He stood his ground during his trial and he confronted Wriothesley for taking away his siblings, so he does seem very fierce. And yet, when it comes to Father Arlecchino, those cat claws retract, and he can't even bring himself to criticize her in any way, or to even realize that he and his siblings are getting the short end of the stick when it comes to dealing with her. I found it very wild that in that confrontation scene, Lyney insisted that he couldn't bring Arlecchino down here because the fortress of Meripede is a no man's land, and I'm here thinking, but you came down here? How is it okay that you're here, but it's suddenly not okay if an older, much more experienced person is sent down here because what, she's untouchable? This is not to downplay the blackmailing at all, but if you think about it from another perspective, Wriothesley's request from Lyney was very simple. He wasn't about to endanger Arlecchino's life, and Lyney should know he wouldn't be able to because she's much more powerful. And he's not even asking that he divulge the plans of the House of the Hearth. All he pretended to ask for was to have a meeting arranged with Arlecchino. And yet Lyney didn't seem tempted in the slightest to agree to it, despite the risk seemingly being decidedly lower than the rewards. Of course, he wanted to stand up to the blackmailing, which is a good thing, but it was also kind of strange to see how protective he is of a person who was willing to send him to jail for a mission. It would be one thing to protect your parental figure, who's loving and caring and has done everything in the world to nurture you, or even someone who's kinda lousy but doesn't necessarily possess malicious intent. But it's another thing to defend someone who will not reciprocate that and has been in fact using you this entire time. In Wriothesley's story quest, we see him attempt to get a Beret Society member to snitch on their leader, trying to find someone like himself who both has a strong sense of self-preservation and a strong sense of justice. These whistleblowers are necessary for the salvation of an entire group of oppressed people, and he himself knows how it feels like to be in that position, so he was hoping someone would be brave enough to express dissent. So after playing that quest, I'm sort of speculating that maybe, just maybe, he was also trying to prod Lyney to test if his loyalty to the Fatui was infinite or if it had some limits. Not to say that Wriothesley was deliberately trying to make Lyney betray the Fatui because his blackmailing was only put on for show, but maybe he was curious to know if any of the House of the Hearth orphans had resentments towards their father deep down, so he can get an idea of why they're so persistent with their infiltrations. And it appears that no, they have no feelings like that whatsoever. That may have made it clearer to him why their members act so brazenly and why their operations run so smoothly without anyone trying to sabotage them from the inside. That's how strong the chokehold of father is on the orphans, completely killing their sense of discernment or self-preservation. Of course, the current Arlecchino is a much better director than the previous knave, and she does seem to care for the children to some degree, and we don't see her in the process of manipulating them face to face, so it's hard to see just how disturbing her actions are. But if you think about it again, would a parent who loves you unconditionally send you to infiltrate a prison? And yet these orphans haven't really experienced loving parenting, so they think this is normal because their father gives them validation and they get a sense of purpose from fulfilling her wishes anyway, not realizing that orphans are not supposed to be ordered around like this. People who run an orphanage and stand as parental figures should only have your best interest in mind and nothing else. You should not feel obligated to them in any way, and you definitely don't owe them anything that will cost you your own well-being and safety. So yeah, while we don't see Arlecchino brainwashing the kids in action, we see its effects in how she remains completely unquestioned by the orphans. Of course, it is possible that the siblings, especially Lyney, are forming defense mechanisms. In his case, it might be a reaction formation where deep down he's feeling very resentful towards Arlecchino, but finds it unacceptable to feel that way because why should a lame kid demand so much from someone who takes care of him already? So instead, his unconscious compels him to express himself in the opposite way, showing steadfast loyalty to Arlecchino even if it's wavering deep down. Well, this is if you believe in defense mechanisms, of course. But regardless, even if that's the case, his defense mechanisms run so deep already that making him snap out of it would be extremely difficult. So now, seeing this reaction from Lyney, Wriothesley probably knows he can't do anything about it anymore and he can only save the siblings from running into trouble within the prison, but truly liberating them is outside of his purview. Oh, and by the way, I just want to say, I'm actually curious to know how Wriothesley would turn out if he were sent to the House of the Hearth instead. Would he still be as assertive as he is now, or would he turn out like Lyney? Because while his foster parents controlled the orphans through a sense of normalcy mixed with a slight fear, similar to the Beret Society, Arlecchino controls with her charisma instead, so it's much harder to escape. However, I will not also discount the influence of his own personality because man, if you have the guts to murder your own abusive foster parents, then maybe you have the guts to do just about anything now. I don't know. But regardless, I think an important question we can ponder on in Lyney's case is, until what point should we remain loyal to someone or something? And even possibly, how can we find the courage to stand up for ourselves? Again, this is not to deflect blame from Wriothesley onto Lyney, but just to try to explore the mind of a victim who only sees the pressure coming from one side but remains blind to someone else holding them back from true freedom. Now, we've discussed an orphan who has developed the will to go against the status quo and an orphan who protects the most important authority figure in their life. But what about a third case? An assertive orphan who perpetuates the same broken system. Yes, I'm talking about none other than Arlecchino herself. Yes, if you didn't know, she used to be an orphan of the House of the Hearth, then dueled the previous director or the previous knave and took on their position, effectively replacing them. Based on accounts from Femine, she seems much kinder than the last director, but that doesn't take away from her manipulation and user friendliness, because she could have used her courage to transform the entire House of the Hearth to make it into something truly wholesome, but instead, she continues on the tradition of using the orphans for her own gain. Of course, it could be that perhaps she's trying to slowly betray the Fatui, or she's genuinely interested in solving the crisis regarding the prophecy about Fontaine. However, it doesn't take away from the fact that she's sort of brainwashing the children into submission instead of getting her manpower from other sources and letting the orphans play or pursue their talents rather than go on a prison infiltration mission. By the way, I'm genuinely not saying this to be preachy for you to condemn Arlecchino. I just need to emphasize how good she is at her job, because a lot of the time, despite my general apprehension with her, I don't really feel that ick when I see her speak because she's so polite and cordial on the surface, making you forget about all the things she's done that's unbecoming of an orphanage director. All the more reason for you villain stands to like her, because there are no loose threads when it comes to Arlecchino's conduct. What I fear is that people will likely end up not understanding the purpose of her character at all. I feel like she's there to teach us about how extremely effective manipulation works and how we can identify signs of it. And yet, lots of fans are unable to do that. Like, they genuinely buy into her tricks instead of studying her character effectively to gain the necessary insights. So, yeah, I feel like some opportunity to learn from her character is lost when people don't examine her manipulation tactics thoroughly. And I think I know why this happens. That reason is that fandom culture right now is far from being conducive for discussions on morality and ethics because, well, firstly, it happens on Twitter. Secondly, people express their thoughts in such simplistic ways. And thirdly, these issues are often raised as leverage to attack or defend their favorite characters instead of genuinely caring about the issues at hand. And I must admit, I almost fell into the trap of rapidly defending Wriothesley so much because not only do I love his character, but I adore his prison management style. And I was really in love with his character trailer where you see how he took care of the child while escorting her father to the fortress. But it also was kind of a response to me seeing these weird tweets painting him as the spawn of the devil almost, completely ignoring his character and complexity. Luckily, my friend once said they were uncomfy with what he did to Lyney, and because they were my friend, I didn't want to attack them with my arguments. That's when I realized that this discomfort with his actions is valid, and I think part of what makes Wriothesley's character so great is the fact that we can thoroughly analyze his actions instead of just blindly accepting everything he does. That's probably a better way of engaging with his character. So my approach to this was by trying to raise thematic questions for each character for us to reflect upon beyond staying stuck in the whole blaming paradigm. Again, for Wriothesley, it's what's the commensurate punishment for a certain misdeed? For Lyney, it's until what point should we remain loyal? And for Arlecchino, it would be how do we identify signs of manipulation? I think by attempting to think about these questions, it makes our engagement with the characters much more meaningful, and we even get to apply our insights in real life instead of going on a Twitter rant like a chronically online person would. I also have to mention that you don't necessarily have to like the more morally upright person in the equation because character attachment can be about preferences which factor in other things aside from ethical conduct like demeanor, speech, design, even ships. But I personally think that our preferences shouldn't prevent us from discussing these characters' morality, or rather, the morality of their specific actions thoroughly. And by that, I mean we don't have to dwell on it either. Like, I doubt that after this I'll have any thoughts beyond, wow, Wriothesley's A1 passive looks really badass and oddly cute. I just mean, sparing a few minutes to reflect can be productive and interesting too, and doing so doesn't have to imply condemning your favorite characters. Because otherwise, it would be a waste if we didn't pick up the full lessons that we're supposed to obtain from the way their stories were written. And yeah, as much as I tried to make it fair, the first section on Wriothesley does seem to be the most detailed and the longest and probably sounds the most defensive, so take with that what you will. I just really don't like narrow discussions about what he did, especially because lots of our opinions may stem from naivete, like we assume that our actions will be perfectly righteous if we were to become prison chiefs like him. But we might have to learn the hard way that people are not as kind and agreeable as we think, leading us to push for harsher punishments. I'm admitting that I myself am naive too, definitely, and I likely imagine prisoners to be kinder and more well-behaved than they actually are, so it's hard for me to imagine how I'll start to think once I actually have to deal with inmates on a daily basis. I'll probably still be fair, but I don't think I'll be super angelic compared to Wriothesley, and chances are you won't be either. That's not to say that what he did to Lyney was justifiable, but I'm saying we might all have the potential to damage another person too, given the circumstances, so maybe that's worth reflecting on as well. But anyway, that's too much rambling for today, so I think I should stop around now. If you indeed made it to the end, I hope that what you take away from this video is that stories like this should be used as prompts for us to examine our own values and assumptions about the world, rather than being taken at face value or harnessed solely for the sake of hateful hot takes. Hopefully, you were inspired to reflect on issues regarding punishment, loyalty, and manipulation, and gained your own insights from these. If you like this really long take of mine, then please do make sure to subscribe to the channel to catch more videos like this involving in-depth character analysis. And by the next time I see you, hopefully, it will be in a much shorter video.